What if European colonialism never ended? When one thinks of the great events of history since World War II, one typically thinks of the collapse of the Soviet Union, 9/11, or the defeat of the nationalist Chinese, not decolonization. However, decolonization is probably one of the most important events in history, period. One of my hobbies is cartography, or map making, and by far the most rapid geographic switch in lands in history was decolonization. All of Africa, as well as most of Asia, went from being European colonies to independence. This is a map of the land controlled by Western Europeans in 1945. Now this is a map of the land controlled by Western Europeans in 1980. See a difference? The ex-decolonized nations today have a population of more than 3 billion, and decolonization affects every single one of them in some way. However, decolonization did not have to happen. Most of the decolonization movements would have been crushed if they happened 50 years earlier. If Gandhi had rebelled in 1890, he would have been executed and his supporters banned. If the Vietnamese rebelled in 1905, the French would have torched the countryside and ruthlessly destroyed them. Why did decolonization happen? There are a few reasons, the first of which is the World Wars. The only two European countries that fought in World War I that came out of World War II somewhat intact with their previous regimes were Britain and Portugal. Portugal didn't fight in World War II, and Britain had effectively sold its freedom to America in exchange for survival. All of the European powers were shell-shocked, bankrupt, and tired. Socialist states came out of the World Wars that had very little interest in empire. The second reason is Europe's loss of self-assurance. In the 19th century, if Europeans killed thousands of natives to crush a revolt, it was a sacrifice to spread Christianity, Western civilization, and democracy in certain circumstances. In the 20th century, with the decline of Christianity's importance in culture, and the world wars showing how horrible European civilization could be, Europeans lost self-assurance in their superiority in the reasoning for their colonialism. Originally in this video I had a very long introduction, but that made this video an unwatchable length. So I've made an abbreviated version, and if you want more details, they're in the description for certain topics. The Allies in this timeline run a much savvier war effort in World War I, not doing horribly bloody offensives that killed off hundreds of thousands of young men, but did not achieve much historically. This would mean that they'd have a lot more young men to work and fight in the Empire, and they'd have a lot less dead. Also, the British run a much more streamlined campaign in World War II, again meaning they have more young men and less dead. Details and description. The British also discover oil in Sudan and Nigeria in the 30s, meaning again they have less dead. Socialist regimes become so left-wing that they effectively become communist, and then an information leak arrives showing how awful Stalin is, thus disenfranchising people from the communists. Also, there's a religious revival, meaning that right-wing governments control European politics, and they want to maintain the empire. Also, Europe maintains a stable population growth similar to that of America, so there are the young men to fight for the empire. What if decolonization never happened? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. Since the colonial empires were massive, it would be impossible for me to make this timeline chronologically. Thus, I'm going to start this timeline and this video by simply going through the empires geographically and explaining the future of each area. Next video will be working off that. Canada is in a tough position in this timeline. It's naturally pulled into the economic orbit of the United States to the south, and shares much more culturally with the US than it does with Britain. A person from Michigan has much more in common with a person from Ontario than she does with a person from Mississippi. However, Canada's heritage needs to differentiate itself from the US so not to be crushed would drag it towards Britain. Canada would be stuck in a tough middle ground. Canada would likely be divided politically between those who would want more US influence and those who would want more British influence. This is similar to Britain in our timeline, who must balance between being influenced by continental Europe or by the US in the Anglosphere. Canada would likely alternate between British and US phases. Australia and New Zealand would be in a similar position. Australia is further from the United States, and so it's less afraid of simply being crushed by the size of the United States if it gets too close. Also, the British alienated the Australians during the World Wars, with the Singapore fiasco and Gallipoli. Australia would likely be much further to the US side of influence than Canada on the spectrum. New Zealand, meanwhile, would not feel as bitter towards the British after the World Wars, and its British culture would drag it towards British influence. However, it would not harbor much ill will towards the United States. South Africa would likely stay with Britain as a power to keep apartheid going. The South Africans would want British immigration and the British military to help keep down the native population. The British, French, and Dutch West Indies would likely not have that much change. These regions would not rebel, since the European navies can simply reconquer them in no time. Meanwhile, sugar agriculture utilizing Indians in the Guianas would likely continue. The British and French would likely divide the old Italian Empire from World War II, with them splitting Libya and Britain taking Somalia. With a continually expanding population, Europeans look for new lands to settle in their empires. Europeans would want lands that would not have advanced native civilizations, and thus the lands would already be taken and have climates conducive to Europeans, aka not deserts, swamps, or jungles. Britons would probably continue to settle in the savanna colonies of South and East Africa, like Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa. Australia and Canada would also take in British immigrants, like in our timeline. The French, meanwhile, would settle in Algeria and Morocco like our timeline. By the mid-20th century, the native population would skyrocket in Africa. Better farming techniques and medicine checking diseases meant that black Africa's population skyrocketed in our timeline. For example, Kenya in 1900 had a population of 1.7 million. In 1950, it had a population of 6.2 million. Now it is a population of 45 million. This would create massive tensions amongst the white communities in Africa about what to do. The excess lands that new Europeans could fill up would start to be taken up by native Africans, and white Africans would question whether or not to cooperate with the native black population and allow them to live in peace, as the blacks would start to gain a massive majority, or create an apartheid system like South Africa in our timeline. Jungle and desert Africa would not see an influx of Europeans, but would simply have small pockets of Europeans around key industries. Without Europeans living in them, they would get far less investment than the colonies with large white populations. The African rebel movements would take longer to materialize in this timeline than ours. In our timeline, the empires were in full collapse, and so the Europeans generally surrendered their empires to the first movement that wanted independence for that country after the mid-50s. In this timeline, with Europeans ready to die over their empires, the African rebel movements would probably not materialize until the 70s. Africa took longer to develop rebel movements because it needed time to develop an intellectual class that could ask for independence and a level of sophistication to make them proper to run the nation in the eyes of Europeans. It would take even longer to be able to develop a military machine that could resist the Europeans for a prolonged insurgency. Would Africa be more or less developed in this timeline? Now that's the billion-dollar question that can get you killed for not using the right words. The answer is yes, but not in a way that would matter to the native African population. Many of the post-colonial leaders of Africa did not represent the people they ran. The tribes were often so diverse that a president would share almost nothing with a lot of the other tribes in the country. Thus, much of African politics became stealing as much as possible from the people for your own tribe. This creates an unstable business climate that is bad for investment. Also, the rulers of these nations were mainly military thugs who had very little understanding of economics, not understanding why they couldn't steal the country blind and then have their economies not grow. This does not even include the monumental difficulties of bringing an effectively Iron Age or Stone Age society into the modern world. A fact generations of Marxist scholars have tried to gloss over is that most of the European colonies didn't turn a profit. Almost none of the colonies gave Europe back more money than they put into it. Thus, the Europeans would try to make the colonies more affordable by expanding resource and agricultural industries. The Europeans were able to construct a lot of infrastructure in our timeline during colonialism, so why couldn't they continue this later? However, the wealth from these industries would be placed almost entirely in the white populations of these regions. This is similar to India and South Africa, both of which were colonies which did turn a profit and had a lot of industries, but the standard of living for the average Indian and native South African under British rule did not explode with the growth of these industries. In India, the British would be able to maintain power if they wanted to. Gandhi's plan only worked because Britain was already tired, and they knew that they couldn't hold India. If Britain wanted to, they could have just thrown Gandhi in jail and crushed any revolt that followed. The British were actually planning on industrializing India after World War II at the start of the war, sort of creating an Eastern armory to supply the empire. I don't see why this wouldn't work. I know almost nothing about the historic business climate of India, but industrialization is sort of happening now, so why not in the 50s? Also, the low wages would make Indian labor quite competitive. The Muslims were the British's favorite Indians, and so the Muslim parts of India, aka Pakistan and Bangladesh, would receive the most industrialization. The standard of Indian life would improve with industrialization, like it does in every country that has gone through the process. Also, nationalism mainly happens at the same time or in conjunction with industrialization. A pan-Indian nationalism would likely happen with industrialization and the common industrial heritage. The common industrialization would create ties between what in our timelines are Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Burma that did not exist in our timeline with Hindu India. I don't know about the French, but the British's favorite colonial peoples were the Arabs. The British would probably treat their Middle Eastern domains well, giving generous subsidies to them. The population of the Middle East would skyrocket like in our timeline, but the British, busy in India, would probably not industrialize it for a while. The sum of the actual British effect in this region would be that Islamist and nationalist revolts would be crushed, and the British puppet nobles would continue to run the nations. More stable regimes would have more investment, and the Middle East would likely be wealthier than in our timeline. Tensions would continue to boil over with the people, as the population would continue to grow, and the growing economy wouldn't be able to maintain a constant standard of living with the growing population. Also, effectively medieval regimes would continue to run the modernizing nations. The French war in Indochina would have a similar outcome. I'm not what you call an expert on the war, so I don't know all the intricacies and how they could have been affected, but from how I've manipulated the timeline, the French would still be messed up from being conquered by the Germans, only being stronger in that they would not have a left wing to heavily critique the war and would have an easier World War I. Even if they were markedly stronger, they could never be as strong as the US, which during the Vietnam War was in its prime and effectively the most powerful nation on Earth, and even they lost to the Vietnamese. I know some people will be angry if I don't talk about New Guinea, so New Guinea. In our timeline, Indonesia was conquered by the British during World War II, but there was a nationalist insurgency in Java that still existed when they handed power back to the Dutch. The Dutch would probably get help from the British to help put down the insurgency, since the British would not want to see an area as big as Indonesia gain independence, lest it set a nasty precedent. The war would likely drag on for a very long time, with the Dutch unable to beat the Indonesians because whenever they would get close, the Indonesians would simply fall back on guerrilla tactics, and the Indonesians unable to beat the Dutch because whenever they would get close, the Dutch would simply destroy them with amazing firepower in the open field. Inevitably, the British would pull out because they would have to use those troops for their own colonies, and the British taxpayer would be tired of continually supporting the Dutch Empire. The Indonesians in the end would win, because of the morale boost that would be created by the French loss in Indochina, which would make the Indonesians feel like they could win and would make the Dutch feel like they could lose. Also, the sheer size of Java means that the Indonesians could continually fight a war of attrition, while at some point the Dutch would get tired and stop seeing the point. To be continued. See what's going to happen next and what's going on in the Cold War and Europe, and what if decolonization never happened part 2. What if Altist? Thank you for watching.